Welcome to the night the sky turned against them. Spring 1896, Northern California. A balloon unit barely known beyond a few military reports lifted silently into the cold dusk. Silk stretched tight above a wicker frame, creaking ropes and the hiss of gas rising into the wind. Below them, pine forests and farmlands. Above them, something else. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and what time you're listening. Tell me, have you ever looked up at night and felt the sky looking back? They were trained to read clouds, to trace the shimmer of distant lightning, to measure altitude by instinct and the hum in their ears. But that night the air carried another sound, a faint beating. Irregular. Alive. The scouts called it the whisper between wings. One of them, Lieutenant Emerson Hale, wrote later in his log. At 900 feet, shapes appeared around the balloon, darker than cloud, moving as if curious. Not wind, not birds. They watched us. The wind dropped. The lantern swayed. For a moment the balloon drifted in perfect stillness, and then the silk above them rippled as if something brushed against it from the outside. Hale shouted to his men, but his voice vanished, swallowed by the air itself. From the ground, witnesses in the nearby town of Marysville said they saw strange lights moving in tandem with a balloon, like fireflies in formation. Others spoke of shadows against the moon, gliding without sound. By dawn, the scouts were missing. Only fragments of the balloon's rigging were found tangled high in the branches of a redwood grove miles from their launch point. The official report called it a meteorological mishap. Locals called it something else, the sky snatcher. What really happened that night? Were they victims of storm of science gone wrong? Or did they cross into something the sky itself was hiding? April 1896. Northern California breathed under a pale spring haze. The world was changing, cities glowing with new electric light, factories humming telegraphs, whispering across a nation that thought it had conquered distance itself. And yet, the sky remained a mystery. On the outskirts of Sacramento, an experimental balloon detachment trained under the U.S. Army Signal Corps, part science, part spectacle. Their duty was observation, mapping cloud layers, recording wind speeds, testing the limits of altitude before aviation even had a name. The newspapers called them balloon scouts of the western frontier. Each morning began the same gas cylinders, hissing ropes, creaking canvas, rustling against the wind. The air smelled of tar oil and earth warmed by sun. Men in linen coats checked gauges, tightened valves, adjusted weights. Above them, gulls wheeled white against a vast blue dome that seemed endless, eternal, safe. But that safety was an illusion. Reports had begun to circulate in California's small-town presses. Strange lights over the hills, elongated shadows gliding silently through night clouds. Farmers spoke of moving stars, and telegraph operators told of signal interference during clear skies. In those days before flight, such stories were dismissed as tricks of atmosphere or airship fantasies. Still, something unsettled the public mood, that uneasy sense that the heavens were no longer empty. The Signal Corps took notice. Lieutenant Emerson Hale, veteran of weather observation missions, volunteered to investigate. His team consisted of 4 men, balloonists, engineers, and 1 civilian scientist from Stanford, a young physicist named Robert Fenn. Their assignment to conduct high-altitude night observations north of the Sacramento Valley and verify whether the luminous reports had natural explanations, reflections, auroras, perhaps ball lightning. They launched at dusk, 7:43 p.m., April 17th. The record logs show wind at 5 knots steady westward. Equipment manifest 1 standard gas envelope, 2 barometers, 1 camera box, and a Morse signaling lantern. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. From the ground, witnesses described the ascent as graceful, a soft orange glow rising through twilight. From the air, Hale's diary described something different. At 400 feet, air pressure shifted unnaturally, not turbulence, not weather. felt as if climbing through layers of silk. Down below, the world faded. Forests turned to black shadows, rivers to dark ribbons of glass. Above them the stars brightened, sharp, cold, brilliant. Hale noted how unnaturally quiet the night became. No insects, no wind, only the creak of rope and the breath of the men. The crew expected peace. But an hour later, strange shapes flickered against the moonlight. Not birds, not clouds. They moved too deliberately, circling, then vanishing. By 9:00 p.m., their ground tether went slack, the signal line cut or broken. From then on, the balloon and its men were alone, drifting into the higher cold. Below in the still fields, farmers watched lanterns blink twice and then fade. Some swore they heard a sound from above, soft but immense, like the exhale of something alive. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw them alive. And the beginning of what California papers would later call the Sky Snatcher affair. The story, as history kept it, begins with a line of type on brittle paper. U.S. Army Signal Corps, Western Division Report, number 117B, May 1896. A document meant to close a file, not open a mystery. It listed all the details one expects in a military ledger. The crew names the weather conditions, the gas type, the weight of the envelope, every ounce accounted for. And at the end, a single sentence: balloon failed to return. Presumed destroyed by adverse wind. Clean, efficient, final. But every investigator knows that when a report sounds too tidy, it's hiding something. Inside the archive, deeper than the summaries, the correspondence begins to whisper. Letters between officers, fragments of telegraphs, memoranda marked confidential. One dated May 2nd, signed by Captain W.H. Broderick. He wrote that portions of the balloon envelope were recovered near the Butte County foothills, torn in multiple directions, inconsistent with wind damage. The cords, perfectly intact. The gas valves, still locked. The hydrogen tanks stood upright in the mud, as if someone or something had placed them back down gently. A technical report followed from the Office of Aeronautical Engineering, the experimental arm of the Army, still trying to understand what flight even meant. They calculated the estimated altitude at the moment of loss between 2,800 and 3,100 feet. Too low for storm interference. Too calm for turbulence. Weather logs from Sacramento to Chico confirmed it: no wind shears, no lightning, no recorded gusts above 5 knots. The sky that night was described as perfectly stable. And yet, at exactly 9:11 p.m., telegraph stations across the valley flickered. The Marysville operator noted temporary reversal of current. Lines humming audibly. 2 minutes later, at 9:13 p.m., the same phenomenon repeated, the same 2-minute window when the ground team lost the balloon signal lamp. The coincidence was impossible to ignore, but in the official record, it was filed under unrelated. Later that month, local farmers near Oroville brought in a length of torn silk, dull gray, waterlogged edges, fused as though melted. When analyzed under lamplight, the fabric showed a sheen, microscopic glass-like in texture, as if it had been exposed to intense heat without flame. But hydrogen combustion leaves soot. This left none. The lab clerk wrote in his margin, "Heat source unidentified." The comment was struck out in pencil by a superior officer. Weeks later, in a pawn shop on Market Street, a leather-bound notebook surfaced. It belonged to Dr. Robert Fenn, the physicist attached to Hale's crew. Inside were neatly drawn sketches of light formations, ovals, arcs, points arranged in spirals. Each sketch labeled with time, altitude, and compass bearing. One page dated April 17th, the night of the flight, described 4 luminous entities rotating counter to each other. Not reflection, appear self-luminous. Below that, the handwriting faltered. A smear of ink, water distorted, carried a single unfinished line. Hale believes them biological, and then nothing. The next page was blank. The Signal Corps tried to reconstruct the event. They recreated the ascent with identical equipment. They tested silk panels in high-altitude chambers, applied static charges, exposed them to frictional discharge, tried igniting hydrogen pockets, but no experiment reproduced the strange fused texture of the recovered fabric. They wrote it off as a gas impurity reaction. But inside the department's private correspondence, one officer phrased it differently. An interaction between atmosphere and unknown luminous bodies may have occurred. By autumn, an unspoken order spread quietly through Western Division headquarters, no further ascents after dusk north of the Sacramento line. Officially budgetary reallocation, unofficially fear. Fear of ridicule, fear of the unknown, fear of repeating what the newspapers were beginning to call the Sky Snatcher affair. The press, eager for sensationalism, ran its own stories. Balloon vanishes over California. Strange lights seen near Chico. But when reporters pressed for comment, the Army issued one line: no further information will be provided. And silence descended, a silence so complete it felt constructed. In 1901, an inspector at the San Francisco depot noted 3 sealed crates in storage, each labeled recovered material. Number 6. Confidential. Inside fragments of silk oxidized instruments and 1 steel hook partially warped as if by pressure. The crate bears no catalog number in the Smithsonian's inventory today, only a handwritten tag brown with age balloon number 6. Recovered 1896. Sky incident. It sits somewhere in the off-record collection among curiosities from wars and experiments the government never fully admitted to. The paper trail ends there, but the questions begin. Why did an experimental flight vanish under perfect skies? What melted silk without fire? What moved above the clouds when no engines yet existed? The official voice of history says equipment failure. The field logs whisper something else. That on that quiet April night, men of science looked too far into the dark and found it staring back. Night. April 17, 1896. The moon hung thin above the Sacramento Valley, a sliver of silver, bleeding through layers of pale cloud. Far below the forests murmured with the wind a soft, constant whisper that rose from the pines and disappeared into the vastness of the sky. And somewhere within that sky, a balloon drifted, small, fragile, and alone. The men inside her were calm at first, 5 silhouettes swaying gently in the dark. The basket creaked with every breath, every movement. Gas hissed softly through the valve lines. The lantern, their only light, swung back and forth, painting the ropes in rhythmic gold. Every few minutes, Lieutenant Emerson Hale would glance at his wrist compass, then at the horizon, where the faint glow of the earth had already vanished. He didn't like not seeing the ground. He didn't like silence this complete. Private Lewis leaned over the edge, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He was 23, full of nerves and curiosity, the kind of soldier who still found wonder in stars. He whispered, "Sir, something's out there." Hale didn't look up immediately. He was recording data: wind direction, air pressure, ascent rate. But when Lewis spoke again, his voice trembled. "They're moving. The stars are moving." Hale raised his head. At first he saw nothing, only the glitter of constellations, cold, sharp, perfect. Then slowly he realized that one of those stars had drifted sideways, not falling, not blinking, gliding. Another followed, then another. 3 points of light forming a line, then breaking apart, then returning again. He blinked. The pattern repeated, deliberate, intelligent. No sound, no wing beat, no meteor tail, just motion, smooth, patient, purposeful. Dr. Robert Fenn stood beside him, notebook open, pencil shaking in his hand. "Not reflections," he murmured. "Not satellites, impossible. Not aurora, too localized." He looked up again, eyes wide behind his round glasses. "They're watching us." The air changed. Not colder, just heavier. Every man felt it, that pressure that crawls beneath the ribs, the sense that the world is holding its breath. The flame of the lantern flickered sideways, though no wind touched it. Private Lewis grabbed the rope. Sir Descending Hale hesitated. Every instinct screamed, yes, but his training demanded evidence. "Hold steady," he said. The words sounded hollow even to him. Then came the sound. A resonance deep and slow like thunder that never broke. It didn't move through the air. It moved through them. A vibration in the chest, a pulse beneath the sternum. The balloon shifted slightly, not from wind, but as if the air itself flexed. The silk canopy quivered. The cords groaned. Sergeant Danner reached for the release lever, stopped halfway when the sound returned louder this time, like something enormous, turning just out of sight. Fenn's hands trembled as he adjusted the barometer. The needle spun wildly, then froze. He muttered, "Pressure anomaly. Impossible at this altitude." The camera beside him clicked unplanned, reflexive. The magnesium flash burst white. In that instant of glare, the men saw it just for a heartbeat, a vast outline rippling through the mist above them. No solid shape, no wings, just movement, a distortion, as though a portion of the night sky bent and breathed. When the light faded, none of them spoke. Only their breathing filled the silence, quick and uneven. Fenn wrote a single word in his notebook, organic. Hale gripped the edge of the basket so tightly his knuckles bled white. He wanted to call to the ground crew to flash the signal code. But the telegraph wire that connected them hung loose, motionless. The world below no longer existed. They were alone between layers of still air and something vast above. The shapes returned. Not one this time, many. They moved in slow circles, unhurried, almost graceful. The air grew luminescent, faint halos forming around the balloon, shifting from pale blue to milky white. Lewis gasped. The light wasn't shining on them. It was radiating from the air itself. Dr. Fenn held his hand out, palm upward. A fine dust glimmered between his fingers like phosphorescent mist. He whispered, "Ionized particles?" Or he stopped. A soft rustling filled the air like silk sliding across silk. Then, impact. A dull thud against the envelope above. Another. The balloon lurched sideways, groaning under the strain. Hale shouted for balance. The men scrambled, holding ropes, steadying instruments, praying the silk wouldn't tear. The lantern crashed against the side flame, sputtering but not dying. Through the smoke, Hale glimpsed movement, long, undulating shadows pressing against the fabric from the outside, tracing along its curve. Not hands, not claws. Something else. The pressure lifted as suddenly as it came. The air snapped back into stillness. The lantern flame straightened. The halo around them faded until only stars remained still bright, unmoving once more. They drifted in absolute silence. Minutes passed, or hours, none of them could tell. Every sound seemed too loud now. The groan of rope, the soft rasp of breath, the faint creak of wicker. Fenn clutched his notebook. Hale stared upward until his eyes watered. No one dared speak first. When dawn came, the valley below was veiled in fog. From the ground, farmers saw a flash, faint, distant, as if the sun had caught something metallic far above. Then the light vanished. Later that morning, fragments of silk drifted down through the trees. Some scorched black, others melted smooth edges sealed like glass. 5 men went up that night. None came down. Only Hale's notebook, found months later, pages water-stained and incomplete, told the story. The last entry stopped mid-sentence, altitude steady, light returning, not storm, not... And then the ink trailed into a dark smear as if his hand had slipped or been lifted away. Some nights near Marysville, locals claimed they could still hear it, that deep, slow hum, rolling through the fog, the sound of something enormous, passing just beyond sight. A sound that didn't belong to the earth at all. By the time spring turned to summer, the paper trail surrounding balloon number 6 had grown thick but not clear. Each folder in the Western Division's archive held a contradiction. Each memo felt like an argument written in polite ink. Official statements on one page, private doubts on another. The gap between them widened with every new discovery. The Signal Corps' public line was simple: hydrogen impurity caused structural failure. That sentence ran in newspapers from San Francisco to Chicago. Yet tucked in the back of the Fort Mason Laboratories analysis, dated May 10, 1896, stood the opposite finding: sample gas purity within normal parameters. No ignition observed. A margin note written in pencil by an unnamed chemist added, "No known reaction to produce fabric fusion without residue." That comment was struck out in darker ink, but still faintly visible under lamplight. Another contradiction: weather. The Army's summary said unexpected gusts, probable envelope rupture. But the Meteorological Bureau's log for that night recorded a steady westward wind of 5 knots. No gusts, no recorded shears, temperature 52 DGF at ground level, 38 DGF at 3,000 feet. The same log listed the sky as stable, transparent, words rarely used together by government observers. No storm, no lightning, no explanation. Navigation records brought their own puzzle. The balloon's tether line, their only link to the ground, was found near a thicket of oak 20 miles north of the launch site. The rope hadn't frayed. It hadn't snapped. It had been sheared perfectly clean, as though cut by a blade or sealed by heat. The brass clasp at its end was warm to the touch when recovered hours later, though the night air was cold. And then, the numbers. At 2,800 to 3,100 feet, even catastrophic envelope failure would have caused a slow descent. Even if the balloon had deflated, it would have drifted earthward over minutes, its lanterns visible for miles. Witnesses on the ground would have seen a fireball or a falling glow. None did. The sky above Marysville remained empty, silent, dark. On April 25th, the Lick Observatory near San Jose logged a curious note: 3 moving points of illumination above Sacramento Valley. 47 seconds duration, altitude, indeterminate motion, counter to prevailing wind. In the published monthly bulletin, that entry vanished. Years later, the observatory's director, testifying before an inquiry on aeronautical records, admitted, "We were asked to omit those lines for reasons of national interest." He would not say by whom. Telegraph logs added a mechanical echo to the mystery. From San Jose to Stockton, operators recorded brief electrical surges on clear nights, always between 900 and 10:07 p.m., always lasting between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. Instruments vibrated as though current reversed, one wrote. Lines hummed audibly like a distant engine. The first such surge coincided with the exact moment the balloon signal lamp disappeared from the ground crew's sight. After the 5th surge in as many weeks, the War Department issued an internal directive: suspend all telegraphic operations during unexplained frequency anomalies. Do not log publicly. Meanwhile, civilian witnesses multiplied. Farmers reported moving stars above their fields. Rail engineers described luminous shapes pacing their trains across trestles at night. A lighthouse keeper at Point Reyes wrote to a local paper about soundless gliders above the fog, brighter than phosphorescence, vanishing when lantern raised. His letter was never printed. Skeptics dismissed them all as hysteria. But hysteria rarely repeats the same time, the same direction, the same glow. Then came the comparison that history forgot. In 1907, when the Army's new Aeronautical Division began designing tethered airships, its engineers were ordered to review past incidents. Among the dusty files lay Case 117B. In the margin, an anonymous note. If altitude increased, visibility should improve. Instead, sight and sound ceased. Gas intact. Men vanished. Weather clear. Beneath it, a single line in faint pencil. Advise avoidance of region after dusk. Science expected constant altitude pressure lift. What it found in that file was absence. Instruments that simply stopped recording. Needles frozen mid-swing. Cameras that clicked but left plates blank. No trajectory of descent, no debris beyond fragments of fused silk, no crater. As if the entire craft had been lifted out of air and erased. One physicist at Stanford later compared the data to magnetic null zones, places where compass needles spin and radio waves falter as if something unseen absorbs signal itself. But even that theory collapsed. There was no known phenomenon, meteorological, magnetic, or electrical, capable of removing a 300-pound gondola, 5 men, and half a ton of equipment without leaving a trace. Fact lined up on one side of the ledger, neat, measurable, grounded. Reality stood on the other, vast, indifferent, uncooperative. Between them stretched an unlit gap where the rules no longer applied. That gap haunted the engineers most. They could calculate ascent rates and gas diffusion, but they could not calculate disappearance, so they buried it. The file closed, boxes sealed, press pacified. The Western Division shifted to daylight tests, budgetary realignment cited as the reason. Unofficially, no officer would volunteer for night ascents north of Sacramento. Yet the myth refused to die. Because between the cold equations and the burned silk lay something neither side could explain, an encounter too structured to be accident, too symmetrical to be coincidence, too quiet to be human. The scientists called it anomalous atmospheric behavior. Locals called it the Sky Snatcher. And in the space between those names, unspoken, invisible, the truth waited, perhaps still circling above the clouds. By late autumn of 1896, the case was no longer an investigation. It was an inconvenience. The War Department had tired of questions it couldn't answer, of telegrams that led nowhere, of reporters pressing for explanations that didn't exist. So they ended it, on paper at least. The last official memorandum, dated November 4th, bore the neat seal of the U.S. Army Signal Corps Western Division. Its final line read with bureaucratic calm, "All efforts to recover the missing personnel unsuccessful. Balloon presumed destroyed due to atmospheric instability." That word "presumed" would be the only epitaph for 5 men swallowed by a calm sky. But beneath the veneer of closure, something lingered. Private correspondence between officers' letters, never meant for public view, reveal a tone very different from the official voice. Captain W. H. Broderick, who had led the initial search, wrote to his superior in Washington on November 22nd, "Sir, I submit that we cease further night ascents. The men are uneasy. The recovered material exhibits heat damage without combustion. I do not believe this was mechanical failure." In reply, a colonel from the Bureau of Aeronautics sent a terse directive: suspend all balloon operations north of the 39th parallel until further notice. The public has taken interest in the so-called skylight incident. Contain rumors immediately. He ended his message with a single cryptic sentence underlined twice: there are forces in the upper air not yet understood by science and perhaps never meant to be. That line was copied into the margins of several internal reports. Years later, archivists noted that phrase recurring again in different handwriting, different years, almost as a ritual repetition. By the next spring, 1897, the world's attention had shifted. The great airship wave swept across the American Midwest. People claimed to see cigar-shaped crafts drifting over Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa, gliding without sound, bearing spotlights, sometimes even human-like figures waving from below. Most dismissed them as hoaxes or early experiments in flight. But some of those sightings matched strange details: altitude direction and silent propulsion drawn from the Hale mission logs that had never been published. In April of that same year, a farmer near Lindsborg, Kansas, wrote in his journal, "One light became 5, arranged in a line, moving slow like lanterns tied together. They drifted southeast, then rose till they were gone. 5 lights, 5 men. The same signal formation used by the California Balloon Scouts in their training exercises." By 1898, a new organization, the Army Aeronautical Board, had quietly formed under the Department of War. Its first internal directive referenced the Hale incident by name. The document was labeled Technical Hazard Memorandum 12. It read, until further study determines cause no ascents to exceed 2,000 feet after dusk in the Western Division. Phenomena remain unaccounted for. Unofficial hypothesis: atmospheric living matter, luminous, unseen by day, responsive to electrical fields. The author was Dr. August Morley, a Stanford physicist, one of Robert Fenn's former colleagues. Morley believed that the upper atmosphere might harbor forms of plasma or proto-organic energy capable of interacting with hydrogen and light. He theorized that the balloon's envelope had not burned, but reacted, that the silk fibers had undergone photochemical liquefaction. He sent his findings to the Bureau of Science in Washington. The packet was received logged and, according to an internal memo, redirected for secure storage. Morley fell ill that winter and died before he could publish. His lab notes were never found. In the years that followed, the story turned ghostly, half rumor, half superstition. Balloon crews in the Western Division began whispering about the hum. They said that on certain nights, when the wind fell completely still, the telegraph lines along the valley would sing a low vibration that rolled through the dark, steady as a heartbeat. Veteran operators swore it was electrical feedback. Others said it was the sound the sky made when it remembered. The Army learned from silence. By 1905, every training manual included a curious new clause: no ascents under moonlight exceeding 40% illumination. No one explained why that threshold was chosen. Some assumed it was superstition. Others guessed it minimized static discharge. But within the small community of aeronautical officers, everyone knew the real reason: too much light made them visible, and visibility invited attention. Still, the echoes never truly ceased. In 1910, a weather balloon team stationed near Mount Lassen reported flashes of phosphorescent matter moving counter to wind currents. In 1921, a pilot from the Army Air Service mentioned luminous waves that followed his biplane over the Sierras, as if studying the craft. His report was quietly shelved under optical phenomena. And in 1934, meteorologist Harold Kane, conducting atmospheric readings near Mount Shasta, described a transparent oval, gliding silently, reflecting nothing, accompanied by a low vibration that trembled through the cabin glass. In the margin of his notes, he wrote 2 words: Sky Snatcher. By 1943, the story came full circle. During a classified interview for the U.S. Air Technical Intelligence Division, the now retired Captain Broderick, 72 years old, frail hands trembling, was asked about the Hale disappearance. The transcript survives, though much of it is redacted. One paragraph remains intact. We thought it was weather. We thought it was error. But I saw the silk fused, not burned. And I heard the telegraph hum that night. It wasn't wind. It was something alive in the sky. Curious, patient. And it took them almost gently. The interviewer noted. Subject paused, appeared distressed, refused further elaboration. That file was sealed for 50 years. When it reopened, much of it had already been blacked out. Still pieces surface in unlikely places. In 1952, an Air Force circular on unidentified aerial biological phenomena borrowed phrasing nearly identical to Broderick's final words. And in the private correspondence of early spaceflight engineers, fragments of the same idea appear: the notion that the upper atmosphere might host living plasma forms, vast and invisible, disturbed only when humanity intrudes too high too soon. A century later, when archivists at the National Records Center unsealed the last surviving box from the Western Division, they found what was left of the evidence: charred paper, fragments of silk, a rusted barometer, its needle frozen mid-reading, and a sliver of notebook cover leather, blackened initials barely visible, E.H. Inside, only one page remained. The ink had bled into the paper, faint and shaky, but still legible. Still ascending. 3,000 feet. Lights circling. All quiet. Not storm. Not. The line ended there. The bottom edge of the page was burned smooth, curled upward as if licked by invisible fire. Today, historians debate the meaning of it all, the truth trapped between physics and folklore. The official record still calls it equipment failure. But at 9:13 p.m., on clear nights in the Sacramento Valley, amateur radio operators sometimes report strange interference, a low rhythmic pulse that hums through open frequencies, fading as quickly as it comes. They describe it as a vibration soft and steady, like a heartbeat beneath the air. Maybe it's static. Maybe it's memory. Or maybe somewhere above the clouds, the same presence that reached for them still drifts unseen, tracing the outlines of a sky it once claimed. The instruments are silent now, but the sky perhaps never was. Some stories do not end. They simply thin out like mist at dawn. The case of the Sky Snatcher was meant to close with a report, a paragraph, a name on a casualty list. But paper burns, ink fades, and silence has a way of remembering. More than a century later, the Sacramento Valley remains quiet at night, too quiet, some say. Balloonists, pilots, and radio operators who still venture into the upper air speak of moments when the instruments falter, when compasses spin without reason and the air itself begins to hum. They call it a glitch, a resonance. But those who know the story, those who've read the sealed reports, pause a little longer before they laugh. If you drive north on a clear April evening near the old pine ridges where Hale's balloon vanished, you might notice it a faint, steady tone in the wind just beyond hearing. You might see a soft glow above the clouds that doesn't belong to the moon. And if you look closely enough for just a moment, you might feel what those men felt, that the sky isn't empty at all. It's watching. The rational mind calls it coincidence, atmosphere, static, electricity, illusion. But in every archive, in every forgotten field log, the same time recurs. 13 p.m., the minute when the telegraphs trembled, when the lantern light died, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Maybe they didn't fall. Maybe they crossed into something else, a layer of sky that hides in plain sight, waiting for the next spark of curiosity to disturb it. Maybe Hale and his crew are still up there, drifting in endless silence, caught between weather and wonder. The Army's phrase, unidentified aerial biological phenomena, never made it into the public record. But the locals' words did. Even now, the farmers and night watchmen call it by the same name whispered in the taverns of Marysville in 1896, the Sky Snatcher. Some nights you can almost hear the story breathe in the hum of wires, the sigh of wind, the low pulse beneath the stars. A century passes. Technology changes, but the same question remains. What if the first men who rose to conquer the air were the first to trespass into its living heart? Perhaps that night was not a tragedy, but an introduction. Perhaps the sky was never empty, merely patient. And somewhere between the clouds and the static where science ends and folklore begins, 5 lanterns still drift in perfect formation, circling in the dark, waiting for us to look up again.